Hello, ladies and gentlemen from all over the world. I speak to 7 billion people, at least potentially. What do you think about that? I feel like Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai. This is God and him. But then, in effect, everybody else. Centennial of a new era, what 1915 can teach us in 2015. That's the title of the class. And that is because tonight is pretty much an obscure date. However, before I state what it is that we all know the last century, 1915 till 2015, has been the most momentous, the most eventful century in history. From the darkest of dark, from the tragic of the tragic, over 100 million people killed in the two world wars. For Jews in particular, the Holocaust, the entire upheaval, the entire uprooting of the Jewish nation. And then also from the high to the highs. The entire world, never been such a successful year. The age expectancy, longevity has doubled. Medical breakthroughs, scientific, technological, economic breakthroughs, humanitarianism. And also for Jews, has never been such a prosperous and successful time. So that's the 100 years. More than any other time in history. So to really understand events where we are today in 2015, as we are in the early stages of the dawn of the 21st century, you can't really understand it without seeing the seeds that are the roots of what shapes the world in which we live and the world that we're entering, going into the future. So back in 1915, no one could have predicted what would have been coming, both on the negative and on the positive side. But there are always visionaries, those rare few individuals that long before an event happens, they have their pulse, their hand on the pulse, they have that ultra sensitivity, and they are aware of what we have to do, Magdim Refuah Lamaka, preparing the cure before the problems, in anticipating and preparing us with a blueprint and a plan of how to proceed. And indeed, there was a man like this. His name was the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, who in many ways, back in the beginning of the 20th century, the late 19th century, anticipated and prepared the ground for a new world. And as I mentioned, it was really the transition from the old world to the new world, where the world as we know it today, the modern age, really is a 20th century creation, and only accelerating as we enter as we begin the 21st century. And as a result, as I've discussed a number of times, he established a yeshiva, an army, a training ground for training young people how they should have the passion and the guidance and direction how to take on these new challenges. But there's another event which is tonight and tomorrow, on the 16th day of Cheshvan in the Hebrew month of Cheshvan, exactly 100 years ago. It was a Sunday that year, 1915. The year was really Tafrei Shayim Vav, which means it was the beginning of the Hebrew year of 5676. I'm sorry. And now in on this day was when when an era ended of 102 years of Chabad Chassidus in the city and town of Lubavitch, and he began his trek to the next stop, which would be Rostov. It took a few days till they got there. Rostov would be the next place where he would be 4 more years until he passed away. His son, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, would then assume leadership and spend another 4 years in Rostov until he moved to then what was called Leningrad, today Petersburg. He would be arrested there in 1927. He was released in 1928. He left Russia for good after, literally you could say, hundreds and hundreds of years of Jewish history there, and the birth of Hasidic movement with the Baal Shem Tov, the birth of the Chabad Hasidic movement. He went to Warsaw, to Riga, to Otvodsk, back to Riga, and then finally, due to the Nazi upheaval, escaped Europe barely and came to the United States in 1940. By Chassidim, they call it Eser Golius, 10 exiles that Lubavitch Chabad journeyed on, from Lubavitch to Rostov, to Leningrad, to Riga, to Varsha, to Otvodsk, to Riga again, and there's different ways they calculate it, but it ends up being in New York, which is where since 1940, what we're talking now is 76 years, right? Since 1940, 76 years, which is still not the 102 years in the original Lubavitch, but it's the second largest bulk of time that Chabad Hasidus centralized in New York, in what's called 770, Gematria of Ufaratzta, which means to spread out to the east, the west, north, and south, which is the motto, the theme of spreading the Hasidic wellsprings everywhere. So let's discuss the significance of this, and this is not just a parochial significance to Chabad people. This is a significance that I would say is universal and global, as just as Sinai may have been initially a Jewish event, it ultimately came to change the entire world, where over 4 billion people today see Sinai as their watershed moment, beginning that spawned Christianity and Islam. The Bible remains the biggest best-selling book. The same is with this seemingly inconsequential event of a man with his son and a small group moving from a town called Lubavitch, traveling on, would seem to be almost insignificant to most people. Indeed, it actually represents and reflects a major shift in history, and a major shift that we all can learn from, Jew and non-Jew, on every possible level. And what is this shift? So I had this past summer, I was in the town of Lubavitch. The first and only time I've ever been there. When you go there, what you're struck by, especially myself, I'm a New Yorker, born in New York. I can't say I'm a New Yorker, I'm probably more I come originally from the world of Atzilus, the higher worlds, and we all come from Israel. But New York, technically I was born here. So I'm a big city, New York. That's my entire life is this city. Lubavitch is the antithesis, a small, what we call a darf. Not even a town, not even a townlet. Even when it was thriving, it was barely a town. Now when you go there, it's a complete wilderness. There are buildings there, yes, structures and cows and chickens and so on. Barely people. There's almost no remnant remains from what was once the glorious town of Lubavitch. And even the place where the Rebbes lived, and I should mention the history of it. The first Chabad rabbi was the Rabbi Shneir Zalman. He passed away in 1812, the 24th of Tevis. His son, it would be Rabbi Dov Ber Schneerson, son of Shneir, because Rabbi Shneir Zalman, Shneir, that's one surnames, Shneiri, but later it became Schneerson. He was the first to settle approximately a little less than a year after his father passed away in Tevis, which would be December 1812. So in Cheshvan Tavkufay and Dalad, I would say that would be probably November or October 1813. Almost a year later, he settled in Lubavitch. That became central headquarters. And then his son-in-law, the Tzemach Tzedek, then his son, the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Rashab, all the way till 1915. So 1813 till 1915, basically. It's 102 years. In the Hebrew years, Tov Kufay and Dalad, Cheshvan Tov Kufay and Dalad, to Cheshvan Tov Reish Ayin Vov. And now we're 100 years from that 102-year period conclusion of it. So 102 years is a place where the birth of Hasidus, which we shall soon discuss, was born. So the shift from Lubavitch, such a town, which really reflected, you can say, the old world, as I mentioned, town almost cut off like an oasis. The closest big city is miles away. And this is where they lived, in a very secluded, isolated, insulated place. But greatest innovations came from this place. Because what is the purpose of Hasidus Chabad? Let's make it clear. It's to bridge the material world and the divine. It's an interface between matter and spirit. You can say the entire history of mankind is basically the search for fusion and unity. They call the unified field theory. The unity between all the fragmentation of existence. In general terms, it's the unity between spirit and matter, between form and function, between body and soul, between what we'll call the material world and transcendence. We all need to survive on one end, but there's also the need to transcend, and and the bridging the two is not an easy process. Chassidus is a blueprint, is an entire comprehensive system that helps us integrate, not escape. It's not asceticism, which is one approach. It's not, on the other hand, indulgence in the material world. It's a way that we find the third path, which integrates matter and spirit. And Hasidic thought talks about this at length. How can we do that? Which, of course, is a question everybody has. Can you indeed take a finite, mundane, very self-egocentric world and connect it to something that is God-centric, that is divine, that is spiritual? And the answer is absolutely yes, because spirit and matter are mutually exclusive only when you see them as two dimensions. But there's a third dimension which is neither spirit nor matter, and that unites the two. In effect, we're able to take our material lives and turn it into a spiritual environment, which is the essence of the teachings. So, of course, in the generations past, the easiest way to do so is to live in somewhat of a secluded, insulated environment and develop these ideas unperturbed and undisturbed by so-called the rush hours of the marketplace. But that's not its ultimate purpose. The ultimate purpose is to bring it into a world like New York. So if you take New York and Lubavitch as two case studies, the Lubavitch being the 102 years where Hasidus was developed, like the laboratory, and New York, where ultimately the previous Rebbe, and then the Rebbe settled. If you think of these two, it's like the two polar opposites, which almost capture the story of history. One is a secluded world in a shtetl, barely with some running water, but doesn't have any of the amenities and any of the advancements of the modern world. And New York is the center of the finance center, the economic center, the entertainment center, and the public center, and so many centers of the entire world. It couldn't be two opposites greater than that. So when the Rebbe Rashab moved from Lubavitch, though it would take years, this was then, as I said, 1915, 25, 35, so it would be another 25 years till his son would come to New York, but it was the beginning of the transition. Because where did he go? Rostov was not a small town. Rostov is Rostov on the river. It's called Rostov on Al-Dan. It's on the Don River. I was also there. It's a far bigger city. It's not New York, but it was a transition. And then from there, where did the previous Rebbe meant to go? Leningrad. Leningrad, even though Moscow later became the capital, Leningrad was the capital of the Tsars. That's why it was called St. Petersburg, which its name is as it's now. You go there, it's the opulence of the palaces and so on is again antithetical to Lubavitch. So this transition, they didn't just go and find another little town. They didn't find it like what we have today, a New Square or a Monroe or a Kiryat Gal. They went into the metropolitan centers of the world, going from Leningrad and then ultimately in Europe, Warsaw, but ultimately New York. So this was not some type of accidental, he could have settled in a suburb somewhere. It was because now started a new stage. The 20th century brought on new opportunities and new challenges. We're now entering the modern world. The modern world is no longer one that you can conquer from sitting in a shtetl, in a town. So you can say that 102 years were years where they built the foundation upon which, like in any education, when you're in school as a child, and then in the middle year school, high school, and then advanced school, graduate school, and so on, what's the whole point of that? That's the education and preparatory stage, that then you are armed with an arsenal to go out and take on the world. It's exactly what happened in 1915. The Rebbe Rashab, recognizing, of course, the war broke out, and so the ostensible reason he had to run because it was close to the front line of the war, but everything has a deeper reason. He could have gone back there after the war, etc., etc. No. It was recognized that a divine sign, the time has come to leave the kollel, to leave the world of the cocoon, or in the words of a few chapters back when we read Noach, when after Noach is in the Teva, as we discussed, Baal Shem Tov says Teva means word, surrounded by the words of Torah and Tefillah, because Teva, in Hebrew, there are different words for a boat. For an ark, you could say Aniyah, Sfina, but Teva also has the meaning of words, because it represents surrounding ourselves to protect ourselves from the raging floodwaters of material life and all its temptations and all its seductions. We surround ourselves with these holy words. Like you see children for 9 months are surrounded by the embryonic waters, studying the entire Torah. When they're born, we surround them with holy letters in their cribs and bassinets. So now comes a time after the flood is over God says to Noah, he has to command him, just like he said, go into the ark and surround yourself with that protection. Now he has to command him. Why does he have to command him? Because after Noah is protected and so nurtured, and the cocoon and the womb of the ark of these holy words, now he doesn't want to leave. Why risk it? Why go back out to a difficult, hostile world and rebuild the world? So God has to command, leave now the ark. Leave your womb. And has to command again, Pruravu, build a home and a family. And the fact that the world can become corrupt, there's a risk, yes, but you have the strength to do it. So that's the story with our lives as well. All of us begin first in a cocoon, in a womb. We build the resources, and then comes the next stage where you have to enter the real world, so to speak. So 1915 was a watershed moment in that sense, where the Rebbe Rashab sensed a new stage was beginning. And he moved to Rostov, and it would begin, as I said, the 10 Gilgulim, the 10 wanderings, just as the Jews had 42 in the wilderness, 10 wanderings, until they came to New York. But well armed. So everything that would happen after 1915, World War I, the Russian Revolution, the great challenges, first under Stalin, then of course Hitler's Holocaust and the Nazis, and then finally the war being over and Jews trying to rebuild. Now we're armed with the tools of 102 years, because what the Rebbe Rashab said, his son writes this in a talk that he gave Yutas Kislev Tofresh Tzadik Gimel. It's printed in Likutei Deburim, Volume 1, if you want to look it up, page 36. He says the following, that when we were leaving Lubavitch that day, that Sunday, so 3 days we spent in a city called, I think, Ural, and from there they went to Rostov. So he says, my father spoke about, he says, our holy fathers spent 102 years in this place, and now we start a next stage of our journey. And he said 102 is the gematria, the numerical equivalent of the word Yesod, which is 80, Yud Samach Vav Daled, plus 22. 80 plus 22 is 102. He said, Yesod is a foundation. He says, because here we built a foundation, and that's expressed in a foundation that articulated in the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. There you have it clearly, that he said clearly the 102 represents that type of foundational dimension that permeates all language. So now we can go with that foundation. Once you have the foundation, you can now go and conquer the world and actually use that blueprint to transform and, as I said, fuse matter and spirit. He also discussed the number 101, that in the 101 has significance because 101 is what the Talmud says is the number where a person goes outside of their comfort zone. 100 is the number where, in the times of the Talmud, they would study an idea 100 times, review it, and 101 is going beyond it. So he said, here we're going one beyond 101. Now when you think about it, what's the point of that? I mean, 101, as he says in Tanya chapter 15, that's the key. He says 100 times when you do something, if it's by routine, as great as an achievement as it is, but if everyone does it by nature, it's not getting out of your comfort zone. That 101, that one time, as he says in Tanya, Oila, is worth more than the 100. What's the 102? So perhaps you can say, because he knew that we're not just going to have to go out of our comfort zone. We're going to have to go out of our comfort zone twice. Out of our comfort zone from Lubavitch to the cities afterwards, but then the real comfort zone going to a place like the United States of America, where everybody said America is different, where everyone said is the bastion of economic prosperity, material growth, but not spirituality. When Jews got on the boat, escaping the pogroms in the early 20th century, it was known that you're going to for security and safety, but your Judaism will be lost. There were people who threw that film off the boat as soon as they came to these shores. They, God forbid, they took jobs on Shabbos. And people knew. They knew, but they thought, at least we'll save our children by sending them to a free land. But America was seen as a land that consumes its inhabitants, in the words of the spies, of the scouts. A land that's material success was absolute contradiction to spiritual integrity and to religious growth. And when the previous Rebbe came, his first statement was, that's not correct. America is not different. So it would be not just a jump from 101, from 100 to 101, it would be a 102 jump, which the Rebbe Rashab alludes to, that would be going not only going out of your comfort zone, but going out of your comfort zone, double. And that is where we are today. So if you think about this event that happened on this 16th of Cheshvan in 1915, it was not just a small move of a holy rabbi to another location. It represented a shift of, now that we've matured to come to a point to go to a far more difficult challenge, but we're well armed with the Hasidic teachings, because Chassidus is that blueprint. Without it, even with it, look what's happening. Without it, assimilation is an inevitability. And why is that? So let me explain why. One of the fundamental challenges, both theological and also historical, is, can we, as I said, integrate a material world with spiritual values? One could argue you cannot. You simply can't. Because a person who's involved in the material world, and let's use capitalism as an example, capital is driven by the principle of greed. Greed is a driving engine of the economy, as opposed to socialism. And that greed, however, will have benefit because people will be innovative, they'll be prosperous, and that prosperity will ultimately, hopefully, spill over to create a more civil and docile, and more civil and a more kinder nation. Obviously, Marx had very good arguments to demonstrate that capitalism actually turned people into becoming dominant and abusing the proletariat, the working class. And the truth is, many of his arguments and scathing critique of capitalism was true. The only problem is his alternative wasn't better. What was his alternative? His alternative turned out to be far more abuse of the working class, as we saw what happened with communism. But some of his ideas did spill over into capitalism, so we don't have pure capitalism today. The fact that there are working unions, the fact that there's a minimum wage, the fact that there are rights for workers, and so on, is a part of the socialism that affected and somewhat tamed the raw selfishness, you can say, of capitalism. But let's take it on another level. When the Jews lived 500 years ago, 400, 500 years ago, the Jewish people lived mostly in shtetls, in ghettos, completely separate from, and were not even allowed to mingle and assimilate, even if they wanted to. They couldn't join the universities of the Christian world. They could not benefit from their social value, from their social offerings, music and art. They were branded as Jews. The only way you could do it was through baptism and conversion, which happened, but very rarely. Then turn the clock. Within the last 300-400 years, everything changed. Today, then you would say 99.9% of Jews, if not more, were observant. Today, it's not 99 not observant, but the numbers are far more assimilation, 50% into marriage. What happened? What happened was that once the emancipation came into the picture, emancipation of the Jews, the new freedoms were allowed to them, they were challenged. What do? Suddenly you have opened to the world around you. So two schools of thought emerged in the 18th century. One school of thought would give birth to the Reform movement. Moses Mendelssohn, as everybody, and as his peers, they were observant Jews. But now they saw a new world opening for them. So they felt, let's have the best of both worlds. The expression was, a Jew at home, a non-Jew in the street. The problem, of course, with that is, where do you draw the line? What happens if your not Jewish neighbor invites you to a pork dinner? Is this a Jew at home, or is this now a non-Jew in the street? So clearly they could not figure out a way to really integrate. So what happened? Slowly, Moses Mendelssohn's students, Abraham Geiger and others, basically rejected essentially most of what they called the non-rational parts of Torah. The laws of purity, the laws of kosher, the laws of Shabbat. What only remained was the moral, so-called, the moral ethics. And slowly Judaism was stripped of its entire spirit, and it came down to becoming a morally humanistic system, which many wondered what distinguished it from Protestantism. As a matter of fact, you may be familiar that there was when Reform came to the United States, there was the thing called the Pittsburgh Platform. And they actually suggested that Shabbat should be moved to Sunday. Since they have a Sunday, we have a Shabbat, why not move it to Sunday and have less distinction? Even the most liberal Reform Jews in Europe could not tolerate that, so that was never adopted. But it just goes to show you how far it can go. And I'm not here to criticize it, I'm just stating facts. On the other end of the spectrum, in Eastern Europe was born the ultra-Orthodox movement, which was, these new opportunities in the Western world, these are devilish forces. We have to put on the blinders. They're freeing us from our ghettos. We have to create our own self-imposed ghettos. So they basically created a fear-based system of trying to just protect themselves from the new evil forces of the Western world. Which, interestingly, if you think about it, ironically, comes from the same root of the problem of the ultra-left wing. Why? Because both of them are arguing one thing. The universe, as it is, science, the Western world, and so on, cannot be integrated with the spiritual values of Judaism. So the Reform rejected the spiritual values, or at least a big part of them, and the ultra-Orthodox reject the world. So their philosophical flaw is the same one. They just are unable to bring things together. One escapes into their ghettos, the other escapes or assimilates into the modern world. But, as I said earlier, Magdim Refuah Lamaka, God precedes the illness, the disease with the cure. At the same time, when Moses Mendelssohn was developing his things, a man was born in a small town in White Russia, Ukraine. His name was Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. And Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov introduced what's called Hasidic thought. And his main principle was Achdus Hashem. So even though everyone knows Hashem Echad is the most famous, most fundamental liturgy, Shema, but he explained it in a way that's relevant to our times, and that is, there are no two worlds. There is no duality. There is no compartmentalization. You can find the divine everywhere. And he introduced the principles of divine providence, and everything is a lesson in life, and we have to discover joy, we have to discover soul, and love everyone unconditionally. These are the principles he taught. Now, mind you, all these principles are not new. They're all in the Torah, all in the written Torah. But he focused on them and saw them as something that needs to be revived and renewed to face the new challenges, that there's no way you're going to face a new modern world without a deeper spiritual fortification. Because 500 years ago, you could have gotten away with the smell of the chicken soup in your grandmother's kitchen, in a holy environment where Elul was Elul, Tishrei was Tishrei. There was no dilution, there was no forces, you weren't walking down the street and you saw other messages. All you saw when you grew up in those shtetls, you saw purity, you saw scholars, you saw dedicated men and women to their families. There was no other world. There was no duality. They were one simple world. However, it was a world that worked only in that insulated environment. In a way, it was like naive. Now, suddenly, everything is opened up. And remember, mind you, all this opening up, then it was just taking down the walls. Today, the opening up is a mobile phone. There no longer is our ghetto walls. You can't create them because it's all in your hand. In your hand, you carry the entire world. So now, the Baal Shem Tov, anticipating that, you could say God anticipating it, sent the right leaders, starting from the Baal Shem Tov, and then Rabbi Shneir Zalman Liadi. And say the Baal Shem Tov said, everyone can serve and connect to God, and the Alter Rebbe taught how we all connect to God. Like they say, the Baal Shem Tov offered the ladders, and the Alter Rebbe taught us how to climb the ladders. So what is the ladder? The ladder is the fusion of how can you really integrate a modern world with all its blessings and all its overwhelming forces, and not only not be overwhelmed, but to transform it into a home for God. The two other schools of thought could not do that. They either had to assimilate or somewhat compromise their spiritual integrity, or they escaped into a spiritual world, into the Teva, as I said, into the ark, and could not deal with the world outside the ark, as you see today. You can have 100,000 people gathering at Citi Field, using modern technology to bemoan the devil of modern technology, just for one, if you want an irony, and don't have an answer. The best answer is to create filters. What does Chassidus teach? Chassidus teach technology was created because God wants it to be in this universe. The fact that some people use it for negative things is like people use gold, was created for the temple, and is being used for people to worship a golden calf. But that's our choice. And God doesn't destroy the world because there are some fools who use it for the wrong purpose. Take technology and turn it into a channel, into a broadcasting agent of bringing the message of God, bringing the message of spirituality to the entire world. That's how Chassidus finds the third path. So instead of creating a compartmentalization, that I'm a Jew at home and a non-Jew in the street, or I'm a Jew that completely cuts myself off from the street, we say be a Jew, then go into the street and proudly bring that spirituality by seeing that the entire world is your platform for expressing what the divine will is. But to do so, we need to have a plan. And that's what Chassidus is. For 102 years, this was developed in Lubavitch. After the Alter Rebbe, of course, established the foundations of it, his son, and going through 5 generations, his son, Tzemach Tzedek, Reb Marash, Reb Rashab, 4 generations, I should say, developed this into a full comprehensive system. I mentioned many times Samach Vav, Ayin Beis. These were the fundamental so-called series of discourses that the Rebbe Rashab delivered where? In Lubavitch. And as a matter of fact, the last mimer he would deliver on the day, Sunday, was the Tez Zayin Cheshvan. The day before was Vayera. That's the last discourse in volume 2 of Ayin Beis. And from there on, he would not say Ayin Beis any longer. He would not deliver it. He continued writing it, so we have a next volume, the written words, but it was not spoken. In some ways, Ayin Beis perhaps is part of that blueprint that still had to be developed, maybe in the laboratory, as I put it, in the Yesod of the Chav Beis Eisius, the 102 years. They belong to the 102 years of Lubavitch. But that's so-called the lab and incubator of Ayin Beis. But the implementation is now. So what did the Rebbe do in Tafshin Lamed Zayin, the 7th Chabad Rebbe, who took over in 1950? In 1977, or say 1976, because it was Yutas Kislev, in 1976, at the end of 76, approximately November 1976, the Rebbe said, now is the time to reveal Ayin Beis, because till then, we only had a section of it, we didn't have it in its full glory. Now, why 1976? I'm not really sure. I think about it many times. Let's say 1915 to 1976, Tafresh Ayin Vav to Tafshin Lamed Zayin. So 1915 to 1976 is what? Is 60 years, 61 years? For some reason, after 61 years, from the time that the Rebbe Rashab left Lubavitch, as I said, 100 years ago, 1915, Ayin Beis became something that the Rebbe, understanding also, he said, some of the risks, said, I'm throwing it out now to Chassidim to now start using it and teaching it. So we have in this Chassidus a blueprint for dealing with the modern challenges of our lives. And there are many challenges, because today there is no more such thing as defense. Today the only defense is offense. As I said, it's no longer ghetto walls. You can still live in a isolated, but if you want the internet, if you want to connect with anyone, in your hand you have the entire world. So what protects you? Not just what protects you. How do you not succumb to the challenges? The answer is you go on the offense. You realize these gifts, these technologies, all that we have today in 2015, and which will be developed in the next coming years, more breathtaking breakthroughs, are all tools for us to express the divine. And the Rebbe Rashab took that first step. The step he took 100 years ago tomorrow I should say, was a step from Lubavitch into the world. He left the Ark after 102 years of Yesod Chav Beis Eisius, a strong foundation with the 22 letters. Armed now, we can now take on the world. It would still take a few years till Chabad would move to New York, but the journey began. The Goliaths began. So here we are today with the new challenges of a 21st century, very different than the year 20th century. Thank God we have the tragedies behind us. We still have our challenges in Israel, elsewhere, but we can't compare it to the bloody First World War I and World War II, and especially the Holocaust. Today we live in freedom. Every one of us, we're not under the gun. There's no Stalin, as the Rebbe Rashab was. There's no Tsar. There's no Lenin. There's no Stalin. There's no Hitler. We can do as we see fit with the tools and blessings we were given. We can send our children to any school we wish. We can learn and study anything we wish, and we can use the world's gifts as tools to spread godliness, to spread spirituality, and to fuse the matter and spirit, which has been the purpose of creation from the beginning of time. And essentially, as it's written many places, as quoting the words of Isaiah, filling the world with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. This is the motto. This is what Mashiach told the Baal Shem Tov, and he asked him, when are you going to come? And he told us to him, Tov Kuf Zayin, Rosh Hashanah. That would be exactly how many years ago? Tov Resh Zayin? Come on. Tov Shin Zayin? 269 years ago. Right? Tav Kuf Zayin, now we're Tav Resh Ayin Vav. Tav Shin Ayin Vav. So, that what? When your well springs will be spread outward. That is our mission. And that's what we are armed with. So the 100 years have passed, but when you think of it in retrospect and you connect the dots, it's fascinating to see the journey. Who would have believed that a man leaving, a Rebbe leaving with his closest family and students from a city of Lubavitch, that would set in motion? What would happen the next 100 years? And here we are standing. I'm here talking about it. My father was born in Moscow. My grandfather was one of the 10 people who committed a covenant, a Chris's bris, with the previous Lubavitch Rebbe to do everything to the last drop of blood to preserve Judaism in the former Soviet Union. We're standing here today. Hitler is gone. Stalin is gone. The former Soviet Union and its persecutions are gone, and we are standing. So you would have thought, okay, he left Lubavitch. Who knows what would happen? But we're here. Now, it wasn't once. The same as the story with his parents, the same story with the Jewish people going back generation after generation after generation. Always despite all odds. Who would have imagined that Abraham, one man, one woman, Sarah, would make it through? And that their son then, Isaac, and his wife Rebecca would make it through. And then Jacob. I mean, there were so many odds, so many chances in thousands of years that the line would stop. And it didn't. So what does that tell us? That there's a hidden hand and there's a divine providence at work. And it's not just an accident. It's impossible to say that 3,800 years of all these odds against us, that we're still standing, it just happened by accident. It's just impossible. Too many coincidences. So here we are, 100 years from when he left Lubavitch. Now our job is to bring Lubavitch here. Which means, what does Lubavitch mean? Lubavitch comes from the word Luba, love. Vich is a suffix. City of love. And Chabad means intellect. So as Chassidus Chabad explains, taking the intellect, cognitive conditioning, applying it to emotional conditioning, Luba, love, and translating it into behavioral conditioning, there you have the structure. That's the blueprint. How we take our minds and align them to what is the higher purpose, our calling. Then we take our hearts and we align that, and then it turns into an action. I know it's easier said than done, but we have a blueprint, and we have the gift to take. It would be a tragedy that after all they went through, what the Rebbe Rashab went through, and his son, and they sacrificed much, and of course their parents and ancestors, and all our parents and ancestors, it would be absolute disgrace if we, with the gifts we're given, where we have freedoms, where we don't have any of this, we're not running and escaping, and we scrounge our resources, that instead of using our freedoms and our time and the ability that we have to do whatever we wish, we don't have those pressures to not use it with the same self-sacrifice for positive things. It would mean basically that they paid the prices. Here we were given this type of easy life, relatively speaking. Easy, I mean, is you don't have all these challenges. We have other challenges, and we create our own enemies. Because today, let's be honest, the demons come from within. Then the demons were outside. There was a Tsar who hated Jews. There were pogroms. There was the communists that hated Jews. There was the Jewish communists. And of course the Nazis. Today we may have some people that hate us as well. We see what's going on in Israel. But the enemy today is within. If we hate ourselves or we don't respect ourselves and we don't behave in a way that lives up to what Hasidic teachings, the Torah teachings, expect from us. So we have our work cut out. 100 years is meant to tell us something. That these 100 years were seeds planted for you and I. It's not seeds planted for other people. Seeds were planted in tears. Hazerim Bedima, they were planted and sowed with tears. So we should have Berina Yektzera, we should you sow in tears and you reap with great joy. So we have the ability now in joyous times. We don't have the tears that once existed. In joyous times to reap the seeds that were planted. So that, my friends, is a centennial worth honoring. Though it's, as I said, a day that you can think is who really knows about it. When you think it put it in the context, days like this change the world. Purim was also an event that you could at the time have said, who really knows what is going on? It took over 9 years for the whole story to unfold. But then it changed the world. So here's a day that 1915, a watershed moment in history that reflected on a shift for us to now take the Hasidic teachings, that Yesod Chav Beis 102, and turn it into a viable blueprint for each one of us, to turn it into a psychological blueprint of how to live our lives, cognitively, emotionally, and behaviorally, all driven by a deeper superconscious of our higher calling. Thank you very much. We continue this journey every week Wednesday, 8:15, 8:30. Today I began a little later because of some technical difficulties. If the World Series can experience technical difficulties, we definitely can. Just to show you the vulnerability of this big world. Right, modern technology. Everyone be blessed. Have a very blessed week. Until next week. Please be in touch with us. Send us your emails. And keep your eyes and ears open to new developments coming from the Meaningful Life Center, infusing heaven and earth, spirit and matter. Thank you.